A 5-year-old girl vanishes from inside her own home while 4 other people are present. Not from a backyard. Not from a playground. From inside a house where her mother, grandmother, and 3 brothers were all nearby. She disappears in the time it takes to blink. One moment she's there, painting flowers with her tiny hands, laughing with her grandmother. The next moment, she's gone. Vanished. And 4 years later, after more than 6,500 tips, after searching over 3,000 acres of unforgiving mountain wilderness, after mobilizing more than 100 law enforcement agencies from across Tennessee and beyond, investigators still don't know what happened to her. They don't know if she was taken by a stranger. They don't know if she wandered into the dense forest and became lost. They don't have a suspect. They don't have an arrest. They don't even have a theory they can commit to with certainty. Just an empty space where a little girl used to be, and a mystery that has consumed investigators, torn apart a family, and haunted an entire community for over 1,500 days. This is the case of Summer Moon Utah Wells, a child who disappeared from her home on a Tuesday afternoon in rural Tennessee. A case that defies every logical explanation. A case that has left more questions than answers. A case that, even now, 4 years later, continues to baffle everyone who touches it. Before we go any further into one of the most perplexing missing child cases in modern American history, I need you to do something right now. If you care about finding answers for Summer Wells, if you believe her story deserves to be heard and remembered, hit that subscribe button. Click it right now. Every single subscriber to the Cold Case Desk helps keep cases like Summer's in the spotlight where they belong. These children, these families, they need our voices. They need us to remember their names, to share their stories, to keep asking questions when everyone else has moved on. So subscribe to the Cold Case Desk, turn on your notifications, and let's make sure Summer Wells' case never goes quiet. Because somewhere out there, someone knows something. And maybe, just maybe, that someone will see this video. Now, let's dive into what happened on June 15th, 2021, and why. 4 years later, investigators are still searching for answers. November 13th, 2024, Greenville, Tennessee. A quiet Sunday morning in a small East Tennessee town. The kind of morning where nothing much happens, where people are just starting their day, heading to church, running errands, enjoying the crisp autumn air. But on this particular morning, something unusual is happening in the 3500 block of Van Hill Road. Vehicles begin arriving. Not just any vehicles. Unmarked law enforcement vehicles. SUVs with government plates. Cars that stand out in a residential neighborhood. Agents from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation step out, dressed in tactical gear, carrying equipment. They're joined by detectives from the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office and agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is a coordinated operation. This is something significant. News crews get wind of the activity. Cameras are set up on the roadside. Reporters begin calling their sources, trying to find out what's happening. Why are all these law enforcement agencies converging on this location? What are they looking for? The questions hang in the air, unanswered, as investigators go about their work with the focused intensity that comes with a major case. When reporters finally get someone from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation on camera, they ask the obvious question: what brings you to Van Hill Road? TBI spokesperson Leslie Earhart confirms what many have already suspected. They're following up on a lead in the Summer Wells case. That name, Summer Wells, a name that has been seared into the consciousness of everyone in East Tennessee, a name that represents one of the most frustrating, heartbreaking, and baffling missing child cases the state has ever seen. When pressed for more information, when asked what specific lead brought them to this address, Earhart does what investigators always do in active cases. She declines to provide details. The investigation, she emphasizes, remains active and ongoing. She can't tell reporters what they found. She can't tell them who lives at this address. She can't tell them whether this is a property search, an interview, or something else entirely. All she can confirm is that more than 4 years after Summer Wells disappeared, investigators are still out there, still following leads, still searching. 4 years. 1,522 days, to be exact. Since June 15th, 2021, Since the day that changed everything for one family in rural Tennessee. Since the day a little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes vanished from her own home, sparking one of the most intensive search operations in Tennessee history. An operation that would involve thousands of searchers, millions of dollars in resources, and countless hours of investigative work. An operation that, despite all those efforts, would fail to answer the most basic question: what happened to Summer Wells? To understand why this case has consumed so many people, why it continues to generate tips 4 years later, why investigators are still conducting field operations on cold November mornings, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to June 15th, 2021. Back to a hot Tuesday afternoon in the mountains of northeast Tennessee. Back to the moment when everything changed. Hawkins County, Tennessee. If you're not from East Tennessee, you might not know where Hawkins County is. It's tucked up in the northeastern corner of the state, pressed against the Virginia border. It's mountain country, the kind of place where the landscape dominates everything, where steep ridges rise up from narrow valleys, where the forest is so thick in places that sunlight barely reaches the ground, where roads twist and turn, following the contours of the land, climbing and descending, winding through hollows and overpasses. It's beautiful country. Stunning, really. The kind of place that takes your breath away when you see it for the first time. But it's also harsh country. Unforgiving. The kind of place where you need to know what you're doing to survive. The kind of place where people look out for each other because help might be a long way away. The Beech Creek community sits deep in this mountain landscape. It's not really a town. It's not even a proper village. It's more of a collection of homes scattered across the mountains, connected by narrow rural routes that branch off from slightly larger roads. Homes here are separated by acres of woodland. Neighbors might be close as the crow flies. But reaching them means navigating steep terrain, following winding driveways, crossing property lines marked by old fences and natural boundaries. Cell phone reception is spotty at best. In some areas, it's non-existent. The kind of place where if something goes wrong, you can't just pull out your phone and call for help. You need a landline. Or you need to know where the nearest spot is that has reception. Ben Hill Road cuts through this landscape. It's a winding rural route, the kind of road that requires your full attention when you're driving. Narrow in places, steep in others. The kind of road where you meet another vehicle and one of you has to pull over to let the other pass. The Wells family home sat on this road, in the 100 block. The property included the main house, a basement that opened to the back of the house, outbuildings for storage, and a camper where Summer's maternal grandmother stayed. Around the property, the mountains rose up, covered in dense vegetation, trees everywhere, thick undergrowth. The kind of terrain where you could lose sight of someone within seconds. The kind of place where a child could step off a trail and disappear into the wilderness. This was Summer's world. This remote property in the Tennessee mountains. This place of beauty and isolation. This was where she lived with her family. Her mother, Candace Bly. Her father, Don Wells. Her 3 older brothers. And her grandmother, who stayed in the camper on the property. This was home. Summer Moon Utah Wells. Let's talk about who she was. Not just a missing child. Not just a case number. A real little girl with a personality. With likes and dislikes. With dreams and fears. A child who loved being outside. Who loved playing with her brothers. Who loved getting dirty and having adventures. Summer was born on February 4th, 2016. By June of 2021, she had just turned 5 years old. She was small for her age. About 3 feet tall, weighing around 40 pounds, petite. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in personality. Her father, Don Wells, described her as the bossy boss of the household. The one who kept her 3 older brothers in line. The one who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. The one who would whack them with a stick if they got out of line. Her parents described her as both a tomboy and a princess. She loved playing in the mud and water. She loved getting dirty. But she also loved the movie Frozen. She loved pretending to be Princess Elsa. She loved jewelry and pretty things. She had blonde hair. Bright, sunshine blonde. The kind of blonde that catches the light and almost seems to glow. Her hair had been longer, down past her chin. But shortly before her disappearance, It had been cut short. Very short. Almost buzzed. The reasons for this haircut would later become a point of discussion, of speculation, of question. But on June 15th, Summer's hair was short. She had bright blue eyes, the kind of blue that stood out in photographs. Eyes that sparkled with life and mischief. She was, by all accounts, a happy child. A loved child. A child who was the center of her family's world. June 15th, 2021. A Tuesday. The weather in Hawkins County that day was warm. Summer weather, sunny skies. The kind of day where being outside felt good. Where the heat wasn't oppressive yet. Where there was still a hint of breeze to keep things comfortable. For the Wells family, it started as a fairly ordinary day. Nothing special. Nothing unusual. Just another summer day in rural Tennessee. Don Wells, Summer's father, was at work. He worked in construction, which often meant long days and being away from home. Candace Bly, Summer's mother, was home with the children and her own mother, Summer's grandmother, who everyone called Grandma Candy. That morning, according to what Candace would later tell investigators, she and her mother took Summer and the three boys into town. They ran some errands. They went swimming at a local swimming hole. It was a treat for the kids, a way to beat the heat, a chance to get out of the house and do something fun. The details of exactly where they went and what they did would later become important to investigators who would meticulously reconstruct every moment of that day. But at the time, it was just a normal family outing. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that seemed out of place. They returned home in the early afternoon. The exact time would become another detail that investigators would parse and analyze. But somewhere around mid-afternoon, the family was back at the Ben Hill Road property. The boys, tired from swimming, went inside the house. They found spots at the kitchen table, pulled up videos on a tablet or phone, and settled in to watch. This was normal for them. This was how they often spent their afternoons. Watching YouTube videos, playing games, just being kids. Candace and her mother had other plans. They wanted to plant some flowers. They had pots and soil and flowers that needed to be planted, and they knew just who they wanted to help them. Summer. Sweet, eager Summer, who loved being outside, who loved helping with projects, who loved spending time with her mother and grandmother. Candace called for Summer, asked if she wanted to help plant flowers. Of course, she wanted to help. Summer came outside, ready to work. The three of them, Candace, Grandma Candy, and Summer, set up near the camper where Grandma Candy stayed. The camper sat approximately 20 feet from the main house. Close, but not right next to it. They had their pots, their soil, their flowers, and they got to work. Summer was excited. She loved projects like this. Loved getting her hands dirty. Loved the feeling of accomplishment that came from planting something, from making something grow. She worked on arranging rocks on top of the soil in the planters, carefully placing each one, making it look just right. Her little hands moving with the serious concentration that children bring to tasks they care about. According to what Candace would later tell investigators, Summer did all the rocks herself, placed every single one. It was her contribution, her work, and she was proud of it. When they were done planting, when the flowers were in their pots and the rocks were arranged just so, the three of them went into Grandma Candy's camper. They needed to wash their hands, to clean off the dirt and soil, to freshen up after working outside in the heat. While they were in the camper, Summer asked her grandmother for something. A piece of candy, just a small treat, a reward for her hard work. Grandma Candy, like grandmothers everywhere, was happy to oblige. She gave Summer a piece of candy, and then, according to Candace, Summer left the camper. She walked across the yard, across those 20 feet that separated the camper from the house. She was heading back to the main house. Back to where her brothers were watching videos. Back inside. Candace watched her go. Watched her granddaughter walk across that yard. Watched her reach the house. Watched her open the door. Watched her go inside. This is the last confirmed sighting of Summer Wells. Her mother, watching from 20 feet away. Seeing her daughter open the door and step inside the house. The time was approximately 6:30 in the evening. Maybe a little before, maybe a little after. The exact time would become another detail that investigators would examine from every angle. But somewhere around 6:30, on the evening of June 15th, 2021, Summer Wells walked into her house, and then, in a span of time that could be measured in minutes, she was gone. What happened next has been recounted many times. By Candace in interviews with law enforcement, in statements to the media, in conversations that have been played and replayed, analyzed and dissected. But the basic facts remain the same. After Summer went inside, Candace stayed outside for a few more minutes. She was cleaning up from the planting, putting away tools, finishing up. Time passed. Not long. Maybe 2 minutes. Maybe 5. Candace went into the house. She called down to the basement. That's where Summer's room was. Down in the basement. That's where Summer often played with her toys. Candace called for her daughter. No answer. She called again. Still no answer. This was unusual. Summer always answered when her mother called. Always. She was that kind of child. Obedient. Responsive. So when there was no answer, Candace went downstairs to check. She looked in Summer's room. Summer wasn't there. She looked in other areas of the basement. Summer wasn't there. She searched the basement. Summer was nowhere to be found. Candace called out louder. Searched more frantically. Where was her daughter? Where could she have gone? She went back upstairs. Asked the boys if they had seen Summer. They said she had come inside. They had seen her. But then they had gone back to watching their videos. They didn't know where she had gone after that. Candace began searching the house more thoroughly. Every room, every closet, every space where a small child might hide, calling Summer's name, getting more worried with each passing moment. Don Wells was still at work. Candace needed to reach him. Needed to tell him something was wrong. She tried her cell phone, but the reception was bad. She had to use her mother's phone. Her mother had AT&T service, which worked better in this area. She called Don, told him she couldn't find Summer. Don's response was immediate. Call 911. Call them now. Candace dropped the phone, ran to her mother, used her mother's phone to dial 911, told the dispatcher what was happening. Her daughter was missing. They had been planting flowers. Summer had gone inside, and now she was gone. The dispatcher asked questions, tried to gather information, asked if they had checked everywhere, asked if Summer might have wandered off. Candace insisted they had checked everywhere. Summer wouldn't wander off. She never wandered off. Something was wrong. The call was logged at approximately 6:30 p.m., the time when Summer Wells officially became a missing child. The time when what had been a quiet Tuesday afternoon in rural Tennessee exploded into something much bigger, something that would consume thousands of hours, something that would bring in law enforcement agencies from across the state and beyond, something that would generate thousands of tips and hundreds of searches and millions of questions. The time when Summer Wells disappeared. The initial response was swift. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Office dispatched deputies immediately. They arrived at the Ben Hill Road property within minutes of the 911 call. They began searching, the house first. Every room, every closet, every space. They searched the basement thoroughly. The crawl space. They searched the outbuildings. The camper. They searched vehicles on the property. They walked the property itself, calling Summer's name, looking for any sign of her. Other deputies arrived. Then more. The sun was going down. They brought in lights, flashlights, spotlights. They continued searching. As night fell, more resources were mobilized. This was now a full-scale search operation. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation was contacted. TBI agents began making their way to Hawkins County. The decision was made to issue an endangered child alert. Shortly after midnight, just hours after Summer was reported missing, the alert went out. Summer Wells, 5 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, 3 feet tall, 40 pounds. Last seen wearing a pink shirt and gray shorts, possibly barefoot, missing from her home in the Beech Creek community of Hawkins County. If you have any information, please contact the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office or the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. But an endangered child alert wasn't enough. Not for a case like this. Not for a 5-year-old child who had vanished from her own home. By the next morning, less than 12 hours after Summer disappeared, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation made the decision to escalate. They issued an Amber Alert. A statewide Amber Alert. Summer Wells' face appeared on electronic signs across Tennessee, on phones, on televisions, on computer screens. The message was urgent. A child is missing. A child needs your help. If you see her, call 911 immediately. The search intensified. More deputies arrived. More TBI agents. Search and rescue teams from across the region began mobilizing. K-9 units specializing in different types of searches. Teams trained in wilderness search and rescue. Teams trained in water search. Teams trained in recovery. They came from Tennessee, from Virginia, from North Carolina, from Kentucky. They came because a child was missing. Because time was critical. Because in missing child cases, the first 48 hours are everything. After that, the chances of finding a child alive dropped dramatically. Everyone knew this. Everyone understood what they were racing against. The terrain around the Wells property presented enormous challenges. This wasn't flat, open ground where you could see for miles. This was mountain country, steep slopes, dense vegetation, thick undergrowth. Areas where visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Areas where you could walk within 10 feet of someone and never see them. Areas where a small child, if she had wandered off, could be anywhere, could be hidden by the landscape itself. The searchers formed lines, moved methodically through the woods, called Summer's name, listened for any response, looked for any sign, a piece of clothing, a footprint, anything. K-9 units were brought in. Dogs trained to follow scents. Some of the dogs were given items of Summer's clothing to smell. They were released to track, to follow any trail they could find. And here's where things got interesting. Several of the K-9 handlers reported the same thing. Their dogs picked up Summer's scent, followed it from the house, down toward the road, Ben Hill Road, and then the scent disappeared, just ended, right at the road, as if Summer had simply vanished into thin air. Or, more likely, as if she had gotten into a vehicle. If the dogs were right, if their tracking was accurate, it suggested that Summer hadn't wandered into the woods. She had made it to the road, and then she was gone. This detail would become crucial to how investigators viewed the case. If Summer had wandered off into the wilderness, you would expect the dogs to follow a trail into the woods, into the forest, maybe losing the scent eventually as time passed and conditions changed. But for the scent to lead to the road and then just stop, that suggested something different. That suggested movement, transportation. That suggested someone might have picked her up, might have put her in a vehicle, might have taken her away from the area. As day 2 of the search began, the scale of the operation became clear. This wasn't just a local effort anymore. This was a massive, coordinated search involving agencies from across the region. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation took the lead, coordinating with the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office. The FBI sent agents, including specialists from their Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team. These were experts, people who had worked dozens, maybe hundreds of missing child cases, people who knew what to look for, what questions to ask, what leads to follow. More search and rescue teams arrived. Tennessee Task Force 2, a specialized urban search and rescue team, the Search and Rescue Tracking Institute, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Search and Rescue Team, K-9 teams from multiple states. By June 17th, 2 days after Summer disappeared, there were more than 100 people involved in the search. Searchers on the ground, teams with dogs, helicopters in the air, fixed-wing aircraft flying search patterns, drones capturing aerial footage, all looking for one small girl. The searchers covered the area around the Wells property first. The immediate vicinity, the woods, the steep slopes, the valleys and hollows. They searched methodically, leaving nothing unchecked. And they found nothing. No sign of Summer. No piece of clothing. No footprint. Nothing. They expanded the search area, moved further out, searched properties belonging to neighbors, asked permission to search barns and outbuildings, asked people to check their property, their vehicles, anywhere a child might hide or might have been hidden. Still nothing. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation held daily press conferences. Every day for 10 consecutive days, TBI spokespersons stood in front of cameras and reporters and gave updates, told the public what they knew, what they didn't know, what they needed from the public. Tips, Information. Anyone who was in the area around the time Summer disappeared. Anyone who saw anything unusual. Anyone who noticed a vehicle that didn't belong. A person who seemed out of place. Anything. Everything. No detail was too small. The tips started coming in. Dozens at first. Then hundreds. People calling the TBI hotline. Calling the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office. Reporting anything that might be relevant. A person they saw. A vehicle they noticed. A suspicious interaction. Investigators began the painstaking work of following up on every single tip. Interviewing people. Checking alibis. Verifying information. Looking for anything that might lead them to Summer. On June 24th, 9 days after Summer disappeared, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation held what would be their final daily press conference. TBI spokesperson Leslie Earhart stood before the cameras and said something that sent chills through everyone watching. She said this case was definitely outside of the norm. She explained that in most missing child cases, investigators have some idea within a few days of what might have happened. They have a direction, a theory, a focus. But in Summer's case, they didn't. They had searched more than 3,000 acres of rugged terrain. They had received hundreds of tips. They had interviewed dozens of people. And they still had no idea what happened to Summer Wells. Think about that for a moment. 9 days into a massive search operation, more than 100 law enforcement agencies involved, thousands of hours of search time, advanced technology, expert searchers, K-9 teams, aerial searches, and investigators still couldn't say whether Summer had wandered off and gotten lost, or whether she had been abducted. They didn't know. And that, more than anything else, revealed just how baffling this case was. Just how many questions remained unanswered. The searches continued, but the intensity began to shift. By early July, the massive ground search operations were scaled back. Not ended, scaled back. The TBI explained that they had searched everywhere they could search in the immediate area. They had covered more than 4.6 square miles, more than 3,000 acres. Searchers had logged more than 13,800 hours on the ground. The TBI fixed-wing aircraft had flown more than 21 hours. Tennessee Highway Patrol helicopters had flown 30 hours. And they had found nothing. The investigation now shifted to a different phase. Still active, still ongoing, but more focused on following leads, on investigating tips, on trying to piece together what happened through interviews and evidence rather than through ground searches. The TBI vowed that they wouldn't stop, that they would keep working this case until they had answers, until they found Summer. But the reality was settling in. This wasn't going to be a quick resolution. This wasn't going to be a case where Summer walked out of the woods after a day or two, dehydrated but alive. This was something different, something more complex, something that might take a very long time to solve. As the summer of 2021 wore on, the Wells family found themselves under an intense spotlight. This is what happens in missing child cases. The family is always scrutinized, always questioned, always suspected. At least initially. It's a terrible reality, but it's a necessary one. Statistics show that in the majority of cases where a child goes missing from their home, someone in the family knows something. Someone in the home is involved. So investigators look at the family first. They look hard. They ask difficult questions. They probe into every aspect of the family's life. Dawn Wells and Candace Bly were never officially named as suspects. Let me be clear about that. They were never arrested, never charged. The Hawkins County Sheriff, Ronnie Lawson, made statements to the media saying that everyone was a person of interest, not suspects. Persons of interest. This is an important distinction in law enforcement terminology. A person of interest is someone who might have information relevant to the case. A suspect is someone who investigators believe committed a crime. The Wells parents were persons of interest. So were a lot of other people. Both Dawn and Candace reportedly took polygraph tests. Dawn took his on June 17th, just 2 days after Summer disappeared. He told media that he passed. Candace took hers on June 20th, 5 days after Summer vanished. Dawn told reporters that she passed as well. Now, polygraph tests are controversial. They're not admissible in court in most jurisdictions. They're not foolproof. People can pass them and be lying. People can fail them and be telling the truth, but they're a tool that investigators use. And in this case, both parents reportedly passed. But passing a polygraph test doesn't mean the scrutiny stops. The Wells family had a complicated history. This became public knowledge as media outlets began digging into their background. Dawn Wells had a criminal record, multiple convictions over the years, some violent felonies, charges in different states: Texas, Utah, Arkansas, Tennessee. His record included domestic violence. In October of 2020, less than a year before Summer disappeared, Dawn was arrested during a domestic incident involving Candace. He was charged with domestic assault and weapon charges. Candace filed for an order of protection against him, writing that she was afraid for herself and her children. A week later, Candace withdrew the order of protection request. The domestic assault charge against Dawn was eventually dismissed. He pleaded guilty to a gun charge. This happened in April of 2021, 2 months before Summer disappeared. The details of what happened during that domestic incident were never fully made public. But the fact that it happened, the fact that there had been violence or alleged violence in the home less than a year before Summer vanished, this became part of the narrative around the case, part of the questions people asked. Candace also had a record. In Wisconsin, years earlier, she had been convicted of domestic abuse and disorderly conduct. The details of that case, including who the victim was, were not clear from public records. But it added to the picture of a family that had experienced conflict, that had a history of involvement with law enforcement. And then there were the other children. Summer's 3 older brothers. In July of 2021, about a month after Summer disappeared, the Tennessee Department of Children's Services removed the 3 boys from the Wells home. This was a devastating blow to Dawn and Candace. First, they had lost Summer. Now, they were losing their other children. The reasons for the removal were not made public. DCS removals are confidential. Child welfare cases are sealed. But the fact that it happened raised more questions. Was there something unsafe about the home? Was there evidence of abuse or neglect? Or was this simply a precautionary measure? A decision by DCS that the chaos surrounding Summer's disappearance made the home environment unsuitable for the other children. Dawn Wells spoke to media about the removal. He was cryptic about the reasons. He said it wasn't safe at his home right now. He talked about all the people coming and going: law enforcement, searchers, media, volunteers. The property had become a circus. Maybe that's what he meant. Maybe the constant presence of strangers, the constant activity, the constant stress, made it an unsafe environment for children. Or maybe there was more to it. The public didn't know, still doesn't know really. What is known is that the 3 boys remained in state custody. Dawn and Candace eventually signed over their parental rights to the boys. This happened years later, after a long legal battle. It was a decision that added even more tragedy to an already devastating situation. The toll on Dawn and Candace was immense. Losing a child is every parent's worst nightmare. But losing a child in a way that makes you a suspect, that makes the entire world question whether you were involved, that makes strangers on the internet accuse you of things too horrible to even contemplate, that's a different level of hell. Dawn described being harassed at job sites, having to leave Tennessee to find work because nobody would hire him in the local area. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone had opinions about what happened to Summer. Many of those opinions were ugly. Many pointed fingers directly at him and Candace. Candace described being screamed at in public, being called a baby killer by strangers, being unable to go to the grocery store without being accosted. The online scrutiny was relentless. YouTube channels devoted to the case, Reddit threads dissecting every interview they gave, social media posts accusing them of everything imaginable, true crime enthusiasts playing detective, coming up with theories, some plausible, some outlandish, some downright cruel. Dawn and Candace maintained their innocence throughout. They maintained that they had nothing to do with Summer's disappearance. They maintained that someone took their daughter, that someone came onto their property and took her. Dawn told reporters that Summer would never have left their property on her own. She was too young, too cautious. The terrain was too dangerous. She knew not to wander off. So if she wasn't on the property, if the searches had turned up nothing, Then someone must have taken her, must have removed her from the area in a vehicle. Candace echoed this belief. She told reporters that she felt in her heart that someone had come and taken Summer, had lured her away, had grabbed her when no one was looking. Both parents desperately wanted to believe that Summer was still alive somewhere, that whoever took her was caring for her. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, that hope became harder to maintain. The case generated an enormous amount of media attention. Local news covered it extensively. Regional news picked it up. National news outlets reported on it. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to it. YouTube channels sprang up dedicated solely to analyzing every aspect of the case. Some of this coverage was responsible, factual, focused on keeping Summer's face in the public eye, focused on generating tips, but some of it was sensational, speculative, more interested in creating drama than in finding a missing child. This is the unfortunate reality of high-profile missing child cases in the social media age. Everyone becomes an armchair detective. Everyone has a theory, and not everyone is careful about distinguishing between facts and speculation. One detail that investigators released to the public was information about a vehicle, a red or maroon Toyota Tacoma pickup truck from the late 90s or early 2000s. Distinctive features: a full bed ladder rack and white buckets in the truck bed. This truck was reportedly seen in the area around the Wells property on either June 14th or June 15th, either the day before Summer disappeared or the day she disappeared. Seen in the vicinity of Beech Creek Road and Ben Hill Road. The TBI stressed that they wanted to talk to the driver of this truck, not as a suspect, as a potential witness, someone who might have been in the area, who might have seen something, heard something, noticed something unusual, anything. The TBI asked the driver to come forward, to contact them, to help fill in the timeline of what happened that day. But the driver never came forward. Despite the public appeals, despite the media coverage, despite the fact that their truck was being described on news reports across the state, the driver never called the TBI, never identified themselves. This was frustrating for investigators. Was the driver not aware that law enforcement was looking for them? Hard to believe, given the media coverage. Was the driver reluctant to get involved? Afraid of being labeled a suspect? Or was there something more sinister? Was the driver involved in Summer's disappearance? The TBI continued to emphasize that they just wanted to talk to this person, that they weren't considering them a suspect. But as the months passed with no contact, the mystery of the red Toyota Tacoma became another unanswered question in a case full of them. Investigators put out requests for anyone who owned a truck matching that description to come forward so they could be ruled out. This generated hundreds of tips. People calling in to report red Toyota Tacomas, people sending photos, people offering information. Every single tip had to be followed up. Every truck had to be checked. Every owner had to be interviewed. It was painstaking work, and ultimately, it led nowhere. The specific truck that was seen near the Wells property that day was never identified. The driver was never found. Another tip that came in early in the investigation was from a neighbor, a woman who lived relatively close to the Wells property. She reported that she and her children had heard a scream approximately 1 hour before Summer was reported missing. A child's scream, high-pitched, alarming. But the woman had dismissed it at the time. It was summer. Kids play outside. Kids scream. It's normal. She didn't think anything of it. But after hearing that Summer was missing, after learning what time she had disappeared, the woman realized that the scream she heard might have been significant. She reported it to law enforcement. The woman later gave interviews to media outlets, expressing deep regret that she hadn't investigated the scream when she first heard it, wondering if she could have done something, if she could have helped. This is the burden that witnesses in cases like this carry. The what-ifs, the could-haves, the weight of wondering if a different choice, a different action, might have changed the outcome. Investigators took this information seriously. They tried to pinpoint exactly when the scream was heard, tried to correlate it with the timeline of Summer's disappearance. If the scream was heard around 5:30 p.m., that would have been before Summer even went outside to plant flowers. Too early. If it was closer to 6:30, closer to when Summer was reported missing, then the timing might fit. But sound travels strangely in mountain country. Sound bounces off ridges, echoes through valleys. A scream that sounds like it's coming from one direction might actually be coming from another. And without knowing exactly where the sound originated, without any other evidence to connect it to Summer's disappearance, the scream remained another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit anywhere. As summer turned to fall in 2021, the reality began to set in. Summer Wells was not going to be found quickly. This was not going to be a case with a happy ending, where the child turns up safe and sound after a few days. The searches had covered every accessible area around the Wells property. Canine teams had tracked scents that led nowhere definitive. Thousands of tips had been investigated with no breakthrough. The Amber Alert remained active, but hope was fading. Not officially. No one in law enforcement would say they had given up. But privately, the odds of finding Summer alive decreased with each passing day. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation maintained that the investigation was active. They continued to follow up on tips as they came in. They continued to interview people. They continued to re-examine evidence. They brought in experts to consult on the case. They reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the team made famous by shows like Criminal Minds, but who in reality worked behind the scenes on some of the most difficult cases in the country. These profilers reviewed the case file, looked at the evidence, looked at the timeline, looked at the interviews, and they provided their analysis to the TBI. What that analysis contained has never been made public. But it presumably helped guide the investigation, helped investigators understand what they might be dealing with, helped them focus their efforts. One thing the TBI made clear was that they were not focusing on just one theory. They were not assuming that Summer had been abducted. They were not assuming that she had wandered off and gotten lost. They were keeping all possibilities open because they didn't have the evidence to conclusively rule anything out. This is both good investigative practice and deeply frustrating. Good because you don't want to lock onto one theory and miss evidence that points in a different direction. Frustrating because it means investigators are spreading their resources across multiple scenarios rather than focusing intensely on one. Josh Melton, the assistant director of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Criminal Investigation Division, became one of the public faces of the investigation. He gave interviews. He appeared at events. He spoke about the case with a mixture of determination and frustration. Determination because he and his team were committed to finding answers. Frustration because, despite all their efforts, despite all the resources thrown at this case, they still didn't know what happened to Summer Wells. In one interview, Melton acknowledged that this case was different, that in his years of working investigations, he had rarely encountered a case with so few leads, so little physical evidence, so many unanswered questions. He talked about how investigators had thrown everything they knew at this case. Every technique, every resource, every bit of expertise. And they still didn't have the answers they needed. It was, he admitted, incredibly frustrating. For the investigators, for the family, for the community, for everyone who wanted to see Summer found. The community of Rogersville and the surrounding Hawkins County area rallied around the search for Summer. Volunteers organized searches, put up posters, handed out flyers, held vigils, tied yellow ribbons around trees, placed signs in their yards. Justice for Summer. Bring Summer home. Never stop looking. The community wanted to do something. Anything. Even if it was just keeping her face in the public eye. Reminding people that this little girl was still missing. That her family still needed answers. Some volunteers connected through social media and organized regular events. They would meet at the Rogersville courthouse, hold signs, talk to anyone who would listen. They traveled from other states, Ohio, Kentucky, North Carolina, people who didn't know Summer, who had no connection to the Wells family, but who felt compelled to help, who couldn't stand the idea of a child being missing and doing nothing. One volunteer, a woman named Adrienne Kelly, traveled from Ohio multiple times. She had young children of her own, blonde hair, blue eyes. She looked at Summer's photo and saw her own children, and she couldn't sit at home and do nothing. These volunteers faced challenges. Some people in the community didn't want outsiders coming in, didn't want strangers asking questions, didn't appreciate what they saw as people treating this tragedy as entertainment. There were tensions, arguments, disagreements about how to help, about what was appropriate, about who had the right to be involved. But through it all, the volunteers kept coming, kept organizing, kept trying to keep Summers' case in the spotlight. As 2021 turned into 2022, the case was no closer to resolution. The Amber Alert remained active. The TBI continued to investigate. Tips still came in, though less frequently now. The media attention diminished. This is what happens in missing child cases that don't get solved quickly. The story falls out of the news cycle. Other stories take its place. The public moves on. Not because they don't care, but because there are always new tragedies, new stories, new reasons to be outraged or heartbroken. Summers' case became one of many, still active, still unsolved, but no longer dominating headlines. For Dawn Wells and Candace Bly, life continued in a kind of limbo. They were no longer living at the Ben Hill Road property. Too many memories, too much media attention, too much harassment. They moved, tried to rebuild their lives. But how do you rebuild when your youngest child is missing? When you don't know if she's alive or dead? When the world thinks you might have something to do with her disappearance? Don continued to work when he could, continued to speak to media when they asked, continued to maintain that someone took his daughter, continued to hope, against all odds, that she would be found. Candace struggled. By her own admission and by accounts from people who knew her, she struggled deeply. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse issues. The trauma of losing Summer, combined with the loss of her other children, combined with the constant scrutiny and accusations, took a severe toll. She gave fewer interviews as time went on, withdrew more from the public eye, tried to cope with a loss that had no resolution, no closure, no answers. The relationship between Dawn and Candace became strained. This is common in families where a child goes missing. The stress is enormous. The grief is all-consuming. And people handle grief differently. Dawn wanted to keep talking, keep fighting, keep Summer's name out there. Candace seemed to want to retreat, to protect herself from more pain. They began living separately at times. Their relationship became complicated, fractured. Another casualty of June 15, 2021. In June of 2022, the first anniversary of Summer's disappearance, the TBI held a press conference. They released new information, not about what happened to Summer. They still didn't know that, but about the investigation itself. They revealed that they had worked more than 5,000 tips in the first year, 5,000 individual pieces of information that had to be investigated, followed up, verified or dismissed. They revealed that they had conducted more than 150 interviews. Some people interviewed multiple times as new information emerged or as investigators needed clarification on previous statements. The TBI also announced that they were offering a reward for information leading to Summer's location, up to $25,000. This was significant. The TBI doesn't offer rewards lightly. It's an indication that they believe someone out there has information they're not sharing. That maybe the incentive of a substantial cash reward will motivate someone to come forward, to overcome their fear or reluctance, to do the right thing. Josh Melton spoke at that press conference. He reiterated the TBI's commitment to finding Summer. He said they would not let this case sit on a shelf. They would keep working it, keep following leads, keep pushing for answers. He acknowledged how difficult the past year had been for everyone involved, for Summer's family, for the community, for the investigators themselves. But he promised they wouldn't give up. The second anniversary came in June of 2023. Another press conference, another plea for information. The tip count was now over 6,000. 6,000 individual leads that had been investigated. The interview count was even higher. The TBI had re-interviewed numerous people, gone back to witnesses and asked new questions, looked at old information with fresh eyes, brought in new investigators who could see the case without preconceptions. And still, no breakthrough. Still, no answers. At this point, the TBI acknowledged something significant. They said that without a significant lead, without someone coming forward with credible information, this case might not be solved. They weren't giving up. But they were being realistic. They had exhausted most conventional investigative avenues. They had searched everywhere they could search. They had interviewed everyone they could interview. They had followed up on every tip that seemed even remotely credible. What they needed now was something new. Something they didn't already have. Someone who knew something to finally come forward and tell them what they knew. Throughout all of this, theories about what happened to Summer proliferated online. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. Some people believed that Summer had wandered off and gotten lost in the woods. That she was out there somewhere, her remains hidden by the dense vegetation, waiting to be found. They pointed to the rugged terrain, to how easy it would be for a small child to get disoriented, to how the thick undergrowth could hide a body even from trained searchers. This theory had some merit. Children do get lost in the wilderness. It happens. And sometimes those children are never found, despite extensive searches. But there were problems with this theory. The K-9 teams had tracked Summer's scent to the road, not into the woods. Summer was described by her parents as a child who didn't wander, who knew to stay close to home, who was cautious about the wilderness around her. And the searches had been incredibly thorough. Thousands of hours, thousands of acres, trained searchers, experienced K-9 teams, aerial searches. If Summer had simply walked into the woods and gotten lost, the odds were good that she would have been found. Not guaranteed, but good. Other people believed that Summer had been abducted by a stranger, someone who had been watching the property, who knew the family's routines, who waited for an opportunity and took it. This theory also had merit. Stranger abductions do happen, and while they're relatively rare, they do occur. The fact that Summer's scent led to the road supported this theory. If someone had picked her up in a vehicle, that would explain why the trail ended at the road. The red Toyota Tacoma that was seen in the area became central to this theory. Maybe the driver of that truck was the abductor. Maybe that's why they never came forward. But there were problems with this theory too. The Wells property was isolated. You didn't just stumble upon it. You had to know it was there. You had to deliberately drive to it. Which meant that if a stranger abducted Summer, it was a targeted abduction. Someone who had seen her before, who had planned this, who had been watching and waiting. And in a rural community where everyone knows everyone, a stranger watching a property would likely be noticed, would stand out, would be remembered. Yet no one reported seeing anyone suspicious. No one reported a vehicle or a person that didn't belong. Still, other theories focused on the family. Despite Dawn and Candace maintaining their innocence, despite both reportedly passing polygraph tests, despite no evidence linking them to Summer's disappearance, many people online remained convinced that one or both parents knew more than they were saying, that something happened in that house, that Summer's disappearance was not random. These theories ranged from accidents that were covered up to something more sinister. And while it's true that in many missing child cases, family members are involved, in this case, there was no evidence to support that conclusion. No physical evidence, no confessions, no inconsistencies in statements that couldn't be explained by stress and trauma. Just suspicion, based largely on the family's background, their past legal troubles, their lifestyle, their appearance, things that make people uncomfortable, but that don't prove guilt. The truth is, nobody knows what happened to Summer Wells. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation doesn't know. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Office doesn't know. The FBI doesn't know. The family doesn't know. And all the amateur detectives online, with their theories and their speculation and their certainty, they don't know either. What we know is that a little girl disappeared. What we know is that despite one of the most intensive search operations in Tennessee history, she was never found. What we know is that someone, somewhere, might have information that could solve this case. And for whatever reason, they're not coming forward. In June of 2024, the third anniversary of Summer's disappearance, the TBI released something new. An age-progressed photo of what Summer might look like at 8 years old. This is a common practice in long-term missing child cases. As years pass, children age. Their appearance changes. A 5-year-old looks very different from an 8-year-old. Hair might darken. Features might change. Baby fat disappears. Facial structures mature. If Summer is out there somewhere, if she was taken and is being kept by someone, she wouldn't look like the photos from June 2021 anymore. She would look older, The age-progressed photo was created by experts, artists who specialize in this kind of work, who understand how children age, how features develop. The photo showed a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes, but older, mature, a third grader instead of a kindergartner. The TBI distributed this photo widely, asked media outlets to share it, asked the public to look at it carefully, to think about whether they had seen a child who looked like this, maybe in their neighborhood, maybe at their child's school, maybe at a store, anywhere. It was a long shot. Most abducted children who are recovered are found within the first few hours or days. After 3 years, the odds are astronomical. But long shots do pay off sometimes, and the TBI was willing to try anything to find Summer. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Because what I'm about to tell you next is why this case suddenly came back into the headlines in November of 2024. Why, after more than 4 years of seemingly dead ends, investigators mobilized for a major operation. Why the Van Hill Road search became significant. And why, even now, we still don't know what they found. November 13th, 2024. 1,527 days after Summer Wells disappeared. A Wednesday morning. The kind of morning where frost might still be on the ground in the Tennessee mountains, where the air is crisp and cold, where winter is approaching but hasn't quite arrived. And on this morning, law enforcement vehicles begin arriving at a property on Van Hill Road in Greenville, Tennessee. Greenville is not far from where Summer disappeared, but it's not the immediate area either. It's about 10 miles from the Wells property on Ben Hill Road, 10 miles via State Route 347, through winding mountain roads that connect these rural communities. 10 miles is significant. It's not walking distance, especially not for a 5-year-old child. It's not even accidentally wandering distance. 10 miles means transportation, means a vehicle, means deliberate movement from one location to another. The address on Van Hill Road is in the 3500 block, a residential area, properties with homes, not wilderness, not abandoned buildings, a place where people live, where neighbors exist, where a child, if she was there, might be seen, might be noticed. The fact that investigators were focusing on this location, more than 4 years after Summer disappeared, meant they had received information, a tip, a lead, something credible enough to warrant a full operation. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation didn't just send a couple of agents to knock on a door and ask questions. This was a coordinated operation. TBI agents, Hawkins County Sheriff's Office detectives, FBI agents, multiple vehicles, multiple personnel, the kind of response that indicates something significant, something that required resources and coordination, something that couldn't be handled by a single investigator following up on a routine tip. News crews caught wind of the operation. Word travels fast in small communities. When law enforcement vehicles start showing up at a location, people notice. They talk. They call friends. They post on social media. And the media monitors these communications. Reporters and camera operators arrived, set up on the roadside, far enough away to not interfere with the operation but close enough to capture footage, to record what was happening, to be ready when investigators were willing to talk. The operation lasted hours. Investigators came and went. They carried equipment. They appeared to be conducting a search of the property, of buildings, maybe collecting evidence, maybe conducting interviews. From the outside, from the perspective of news crews and curious onlookers, it was impossible to tell exactly what was happening, what they were looking for, what they might have found. When TBI spokesperson Leslie Earhart finally spoke to the media, her statement was brief and carefully worded. She confirmed that investigators were following up on a lead in the Summer Wells case. When asked what information had led them to this specific location, she declined to provide details. When asked what they were looking for, she declined to provide details. When asked what they had found, she declined to provide details. The investigation, she emphasized multiple times, remains active and ongoing, which is law enforcement speak, for we're not going to tell you anything that might compromise our case. This is standard procedure in active investigations, especially in cases that might eventually go to trial. Investigators don't want to reveal details that could tip off suspects. That could give someone an opportunity to destroy evidence or coordinate stories. That could be used by defense attorneys to argue that the investigation was biased or that evidence was contaminated by public knowledge. So they stay quiet. They say as little as possible. They confirm only what is already obvious and decline to elaborate on anything else. But the fact that this operation happened at all is significant. The TBI doesn't mobilize multiple agencies for routine follow-ups. They don't conduct major field operations based on vague tips or unreliable information. For them to commit these resources, to coordinate with the FBI and local law enforcement, to spend hours at this location, they must have had a credible reason. They must have received information that they believed was worth investigating. Information that might, possibly, finally provide answers about what happened to Summer Wells. So, what could have led investigators to Van Hill Road? What kind of information would warrant this level of response? There are several possibilities, and it's important to note that these are just possibilities. Speculation based on what we know about how these investigations typically work. Not facts, not confirmed information, just educated guesses about what might have prompted this operation. One possibility is that investigators received a tip about a specific person, someone who lived at or had access to the Van Hill Road property, someone who might have information about Summer's disappearance, maybe someone who was in the area on June 15, 2021, someone who owned a vehicle that matched descriptions from that day, someone whose timeline or alibi didn't quite add up. Investigators might have been there to interview this person, to search their property, to look for evidence that might connect them to Summer's case. Another possibility is that investigators received information about evidence being hidden or disposed of at this location. Maybe someone came forward with information. Maybe someone said they saw something suspicious, someone burying something, someone disposing of items, someone acting strangely around the time Summer disappeared. This kind of information would definitely warrant a search. Would require investigators to examine the property thoroughly, to look for anything that might be connected to a missing child case. A third possibility is that investigators were following up on forensic evidence. Maybe something was found months or years ago. DNA, fiber evidence, something that couldn't be identified at the time. And maybe recent testing or comparison finally linked that evidence to this location or to someone associated with this location. Forensic technology improves constantly. Cases that were unsolvable 5 years ago might be solvable now. DNA databases expand. Comparison techniques get better. Maybe something that meant nothing in 2021 finally connected to something in 2024. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that everyone hopes for in cases like this, someone with direct knowledge finally came forward. Maybe someone who was involved. Maybe someone who knew what happened. Someone whose conscience finally got the better of them. Someone who couldn't live with the secret anymore. Someone who decided to tell the truth. If that's what happened, if someone came forward with direct knowledge, that would absolutely warrant the kind of operation we saw on Van Hill Road. That would require investigators to verify the information, to search for evidence that corroborates what they've been told, to build a case that can survive scrutiny in court. The problem is, we don't know. Leslie Earhart's refusal to provide details means we're all left to speculate. And speculation, no matter how educated, is still just guessing. What we do know is that something significant happened. Something that investigators believed was worth pursuing. Something that might, possibly, move this case forward after more than 4 years of seeming stagnation. In the days following the Van Hill Road search, media outlets tried to dig deeper, tried to find out more information. Some reporters knocked on doors in the neighborhood, asked residents what they knew, whether they had seen anything, whether they knew why investigators were interested in that particular property. Some residents spoke to media. Most said they didn't know anything, hadn't seen anything unusual, were surprised by all the law enforcement activity. A few said they had been interviewed by investigators, but declined to discuss what they were asked. One thing that became clear from these media reports is that the Van Hill Road property is not abandoned. It's not some remote location where evidence could be hidden for years without anyone noticing. It's a residential property in a community where people live. where neighbors exist. This raised interesting questions. If something related to Summer's disappearance happened at or near this location, how could it have remained hidden for more than 4 years? How could someone keep that kind of secret in a place where people are around, where neighbors might see things? The answer, if there is one, probably lies in the nature of rural communities. People mind their own business. Properties can be large enough that what happens on one part isn't visible from neighbors. People come and go. Things get moved around. And unless someone has a specific reason to be suspicious, unless something seems obviously wrong, most people don't think twice about what their neighbors are doing. Add to that the fact that this location is 10 miles from where Summer disappeared. Unless someone was specifically looking for a connection between this property and Summer's case, unless there was obvious evidence, there would be no reason for anyone to associate this location with a missing child from a different community. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, in the weeks following the Van Hill Road search, maintained their silence. When asked for updates, they provided none. When asked whether the search had yielded any useful information, they declined to comment. When asked whether they were closer to solving the case, they said the investigation remains active and ongoing. The same careful, non-committal language they've been using for 4 years. It's frustrating. For the public, for the media, for everyone who wants answers. But it's also necessary. If the TBI is building a case, if they have evidence or testimony that might lead to an arrest, they can't jeopardize that by revealing too much too soon. So, as December of 2024 approaches, as I'm recording this video, we're left with more questions than answers. What did investigators find on Van Hill Road? Did they find anything at all? Was this another dead end in a case full of dead ends? Or was this finally the breakthrough everyone has been hoping for? We don't know. And we might not know for a long time. Maybe months. Maybe years. Maybe never. If what they found doesn't pan out. If the lead that took them to Van Hill Road ends up being another false trail in a case that has had so many. What we do know is this. Summer Wells has been missing for over 1,500 days. Over 4 years. She would be 8 years old now if she's still alive. 8 years old. 3rd grade. Learning multiplication. Reading chapter books. Playing with friends. Living a normal life. That's what should be happening. That's the life Summer should be living. Instead, she's a photograph. An age-progressed image. A name on an Amber Alert that's still active after all this time. She's a mystery. A question without an answer. A little girl who disappeared and left behind nothing but heartbreak and confusion. The statistics on long-term missing child cases are grim. The longer a child is missing, the less likely they are to be found alive. After the first 48 hours, the odds drop dramatically. After the first week, they drop even more. After the first month, recovery of a living child becomes statistically unlikely. After a year, it becomes rare. After 4 years, it becomes almost unheard of. Not impossible, but almost. There are cases of children being recovered alive after years in captivity. J.C. Dugard, Elizabeth Smart, Sean Hornbeck. These cases give families hope. Give investigators reason to keep searching. Keep believing that maybe, just maybe, this will be another one of those cases. Another miracle. But for every J.C. Dugard, for every Elizabeth Smart, there are hundreds of cases that don't end that way. Children who are never found. Families who never get answers. Cases that remain open for decades. That eventually get transferred to cold case units, where overworked detectives do their best, but don't have the resources to actively work them. That slowly fade from public consciousness until hardly anyone remembers the child's name anymore. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has vowed that won't happen with Summer's case. Josh Melton has said repeatedly that they won't let this case sit on a shelf. That they'll keep working it. Keep following up on tips, keep pushing for answers. And to their credit, they have. 4 years later, they're still conducting field operations. Still investigating leads. Still treating this as an active case, not a cold one. That's more than many families get. That's more than many missing children get. But vows and promises, no matter how sincere, don't bring children home. What brings children home is evidence. Witnesses, confessions, Breaks in cases that come from someone finally doing the right thing and coming forward with information. And that's what the TBI is still waiting for. That one person. That one piece of information. That one break that will finally make sense of what happened on June 15, 2021. Don Wells continues to hold out hope. In interviews over the years, he's talked about the possibilities that haunt him. Maybe Summer is being cared for somewhere. Maybe whoever took her wanted a child, is treating her well, is raising her as their own. Maybe she's suffering. Maybe she's locked away somewhere. Maybe she doesn't even remember her real family anymore. He doesn't know. And that not knowing is its own kind of torture. He's also realistic. He knows that after 4 years, the likelihood of Summer being alive decreases with each day. He knows what the statistics say, but he chooses to hope anyway. Because what else can a parent do? Candace has been less public in recent years. She's given fewer interviews, withdrawn more from the spotlight, dealing with her grief in private, trying to cope with a loss that has no resolution, no closure, no body to bury, no grave to visit, just an absence, a hole where her daughter used to be, and the constant, gnawing question. What happened? What happened to my baby? It's a question she may never have answered, a question she'll carry with her for the rest of her life. The community hasn't forgotten Summer. Yellow ribbons still hang from trees and fences in Hawkins County. Signs still appear in yards. Justice for Summer. Never stop looking. Bring Summer home. Vigils are still held on significant dates. On her birthday. On the anniversary of her disappearance. People gather, light candles, say prayers, share memories, and vow to keep her name alive. Because in missing child cases, keeping the name alive is sometimes all you can do. Keeping the face in the public eye. Making sure people don't forget. Making sure that if someone out there knows something, they're constantly reminded that people are still looking, still asking questions, still demanding answers. The volunteers who connected online continue their efforts. They've organized themselves into groups, created social media pages dedicated to Summer's case. They share updates. They share information. They organize events. They coordinate with law enforcement when possible, being careful not to interfere but trying to help however they can. Some of these volunteers have dedicated hundreds of hours to Summer's case, hours spent researching, analyzing, organizing, advocating. They've never met Summer, never met her family, but they feel connected to this case, feel like they need to do something, feel like giving up would be letting Summer down. This is the power of cases like this. They capture something in people, make them care about a child they've never met, make them invest time and emotion into finding answers. It's beautiful in a way, this outpouring of concern from strangers, this collective determination that this child matters, that her life has value, that she deserves to be found. But it's also heartbreaking, because all this care, all this effort, all these thousands of hours from professional investigators and volunteer advocates, and we still don't know what happened to Summer Wells. The red Toyota Tacoma remains unidentified, despite the media coverage, despite the specific description, despite the TBI's repeated requests for the driver to come forward. The truck that was seen near the Wells property on June 14th or 15th, 2021, has never been conclusively identified. The driver has never come forward. This remains one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Because that truck might mean nothing. It might have been someone completely innocent who was in the area for a legitimate reason, and who either doesn't know that law enforcement is looking for them, or who is afraid to get involved. Or it might mean everything. It might be the key to understanding what happened, and the fact that it remains unidentified, the fact that this potential witness or potential suspect is still out there somewhere, is maddening. The scream that the neighbor heard has never been explained. Was it Summer? Was it another child playing? Was it unrelated to the disappearance entirely? Without other evidence to connect it to what happened, without a way to pinpoint exactly when it occurred and where it came from, it remains another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit anywhere. Another detail that might be significant, or might mean nothing. The K9 tracking results that indicated Summer's scent led to the road and then disappeared have never been fully reconciled with other aspects of the case. If Summer made it to the road, how did she get there? Did she walk? Why would she walk to the road? She had just gone inside the house. She had just gotten a piece of candy from her grandmother. She was inside, presumably about to play with her toys or hang out with her brothers. Why would she suddenly decide to leave the house and walk to the road? And if she didn't walk there voluntarily, if someone carried her or led her, who? And how did they do it without being seen? Without leaving more evidence? These are the questions that have plagued investigators for 4 years. Questions that should have answers but don't. Questions that lead to more questions instead of to conclusions. This is what makes the Summer Wells case so difficult, so frustrating, so baffling. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every tip, seems to raise more questions than it answers. Nothing quite fits together. Nothing quite makes sense. It's like trying to assemble a puzzle when you don't have all the pieces, and the pieces you do have don't seem to belong to the same picture. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has worked over 6,500 tips in this case. 6,500 individual pieces of information that someone thought might be relevant. Some of those tips were probably well-intentioned, but useless. People calling in to report red Toyota Tacomas they saw, all of which turned out to be unrelated. People calling in with theories, or hunches, or vague suspicions that led nowhere. But buried in those 6,500 tips, investigators believe, might be the key to solving this case. The one piece of information that, combined with what they already know, would finally make everything make sense. The challenge is finding it. Identifying which tip, out of 6,500, is the one that matters. They've conducted over 200 interviews by now. Some people interviewed once, some interviewed multiple times, as new information emerged, or as investigators needed clarification. They've interviewed family members, neighbors, friends, acquaintances, people who were in the area that day, people who might have seen something, people who might know something. And from those hundreds of interviews, they've built a timeline of that day. They know, as much as anyone can know, what happened hour by hour, minute by minute in some cases. They know where people were, what they were doing, who they were with. They've verified alibis, checked phone records, examined surveillance footage from businesses and homes in the surrounding area. They've done everything you would expect a professional investigation to do, and they've found nothing that definitively tells them what happened to Summer. This is the reality of some cases. Despite the best technology, despite expert investigators, despite unlimited resources and time, some cases remain unsolved. Some mysteries remain mysteries. And the Summer Wells case, 4 years in, is starting to look like it might be one of them. That's not to say it will never be solved. Cold cases get solved all the time. Sometimes decades later, someone comes forward with new information. New technology allows old evidence to be re-examined. A deathbed confession. A witness who was too afraid to speak up finally finding the courage. Cases that seemed hopeless suddenly break wide open. So there's always hope. Always a chance. But with each passing year, that chance gets smaller. The Van Hill Road search in November 2024 was a reminder that the investigation is still active, still moving, still following leads. It gave people hope that maybe, finally, there would be a breakthrough. But as the weeks have passed since that search, with no announcement of an arrest, with no press conference revealing major developments, that hope has begun to fade again. This might have been another lead that didn't pan out, another promising tip that ultimately led nowhere. Or it might be the beginning of something bigger, something that investigators are still building, something that will eventually result in answers. We won't know until the TBI decides to tell us. And they've made it clear they're not ready to do that yet. So, where does that leave us? Where does it leave the investigation? Where does it leave Summer's family? Where does it leave everyone who has invested time and emotion into this case? In a state of limbo, waiting, hoping, wondering. It's an uncomfortable place to be. Humans like resolution. We like answers. We like to know how stories end. The Summer Wells case doesn't have an ending yet. Just a middle section that keeps getting longer. A narrative that refuses to resolve itself. For the investigators working this case, the frustration must be immense. They've done everything right. They've followed every lead. They've exhausted every avenue. They've brought in experts. They've used every tool at their disposal. and they still don't have the answers they need. Josh Melton's statement that they've thrown everything they know at this case and still don't have answers is telling. It reveals the depth of their frustration, the reality that sometimes, no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you work, some cases just don't break. But they keep working. That's what investigators do. They don't have the luxury of giving up. They don't have the option of saying this case is too hard and walking away. As long as Summer Wells is missing, as long as her family doesn't have answers, as long as there's even the smallest chance that the next tip will be the one that solves it, they have to keep going, have to keep working, have to keep pushing. It's exhausting, it's frustrating, it's heartbreaking, but it's the job. For Don Wells, 4 years later, life goes on in a painful kind of way. He works. He tries to maintain some kind of normalcy. But there's always the absence. Always the questions. Always the wondering. He still does interviews occasionally. Still talks about Summer when asked. Still maintains that someone took his daughter. Still hopes she's out there somewhere. Still dreams about the day his phone rings and someone tells him they've found her. Found her alive. Found her safe. It's probably an unrealistic hope at this point, but it's the hope that keeps him going. The alternative, accepting that Summer is gone forever, that's too painful to contemplate. For Candace, the past 4 years have been even more difficult. She's dealt with not just the loss of Summer but the loss of her other children, the dissolution of her relationship with Don at times, the constant public scrutiny, the accusations, the hatred directed at her by people who have decided she must be responsible. She's struggled with mental health issues, with substance abuse, with depression and anxiety and trauma. Her life has been defined by what happened on June 15, 2021. Everything is before Summer disappeared or after Summer disappeared. There's no other marker, no other reference point. Just that day, that moment, that loss. The 3 boys, Summer's brothers, are living somewhere else now. Hopefully in a stable environment. Hopefully with people who care for them. Hopefully able to process their own trauma in a healthy way. They lost their sister. They lost their parents. They lost their home. They lost everything familiar. And they're old enough to know what people say about their family. Old enough to hear the accusations. To see the social media posts. To understand that their family is at the center of a mystery that has gripped their community and beyond. That's a heavy burden for children to carry. The hope is that wherever they are, they're getting the support they need. The therapy. The care. The chance to be kids despite everything they've been through. The impact of Summer's disappearance extends beyond just her immediate family. It's affected the entire community. There's a wariness now. A loss of innocence. Before June 15, 2021, this was a quiet rural community where kids could play outside without constant supervision, where people knew their neighbors, where crime was relatively rare. Now, there's fear. Parents keep closer watch on their children. People lock their doors. There's suspicion. If Summer could disappear from her own home with family members present, then no one is safe. No child is completely protected. That realization has changed how people live, how they parent, how they view their community. There's also frustration. Frustration that after all this time, there are still no answers. Frustration that someone out there might know something and isn't coming forward. Frustration that despite everything, despite the searches and the investigation and the media attention, Summer is still missing. Some people have moved on, stopped thinking about it daily, stopped checking for updates. Life has a way of continuing even in the midst of tragedy. But for many in the community, Summer's disappearance is always there. A shadow. A reminder that sometimes bad things happen and there's nothing you can do to prevent them or fix them. The volunteers who have dedicated so much time to Summer's case continue their efforts, but even they feel the weight of time. 4 years is a long time to maintain intense focus on a single case. Some volunteers have stepped back, moved on to other cases or other causes. Others remain committed. Still organizing events, still sharing updates, still advocating for Summer, still refusing to let her be forgotten. These volunteers understand that in long-term missing person cases, consistent public attention can make the difference, can keep pressure on investigators, can keep the case in the public consciousness. can increase the chances that someone who knows something will finally come forward. But maintaining that attention is hard work. It requires constant effort, constant creativity in finding new ways to keep people engaged, new events to organize, new content to create, new angles to explore. And after 4 years, it gets harder. The well of new information runs dry. There are only so many ways to tell the same story. Only so many times you can share the same photo and hope it reaches someone new. The volunteers do their best, but they're fighting against human nature, against the tendency to move on, to focus on new tragedies, to forget. Summer Wells deserves better than to be forgotten. She deserves to have her case solved. She deserves to be found, whether that means found alive or found so she can be laid to rest. She deserves justice, whatever that looks like. She deserves for her family to have answers, to know what happened, to be able to grieve properly and move forward. She deserves for whoever is responsible for her disappearance to be held accountable, to face consequences, to not get away with destroying a family and traumatizing a community. But deserve has nothing to do with what actually happens. Life isn't fair. Justice isn't guaranteed. Some cases get solved, some don't. Some families get answers, some don't. And as much as we wish otherwise, as much as we want every missing child to be found, every mystery to be solved, every wrong to be righted, that's not reality. Reality is messy and complicated, and sometimes deeply unsatisfying. Reality is a 5-year-old girl disappearing from her home, and 4 years later no one knowing why or how or where she is. The Amber Alert for Summer Wells remains active. This is unusual. Amber Alerts are typically resolved within hours or days. They're issued for acute situations, immediate danger, time-critical searches. They're not meant to stay active for years. But Summer's Amber Alert has never been canceled. It's still out there, still active, still asking people to be on the lookout for a child who has been missing for over 1,500 days, who, if she's still alive, looks nothing like the photo on the alert anymore. This is both a testament to the TBI's commitment to the case and a symbol of how unusual this investigation has been. Nothing about it has followed the normal patterns. Nothing has been typical or expected. The reward money, $25,000, still stands. Anyone with information that leads to finding Summer can claim that reward. $25,000 is significant money, especially in rural Appalachia. It should be enough to motivate someone who has information to come forward. But so far, no one has claimed it. Either no one has credible information worth that money, or whoever has information is more afraid of the consequences of coming forward than they are motivated by the reward. Fear can be a powerful motivator to stay silent. Fear of being implicated in a crime, fear of retaliation, fear of law enforcement, fear of getting involved in something messy and complicated. Whatever the reason, the reward sits unclaimed. Some people have speculated about what kind of information the TBI is looking for. What would be worth $25,000? Presumably, information that directly leads to finding Summer. Information that allows investigators to locate her, whether alive or deceased. Information that provides concrete evidence about what happened to her. Not theories, not speculation, but actual, actionable information that moves the case forward in a meaningful way. That's a high bar. That's asking for someone with direct knowledge to come forward. And maybe that person doesn't exist. Maybe no one has that kind of information. Or maybe they do, and they're keeping quiet for reasons we can't understand. The possibility that haunts everyone involved in this case is that Summer may never be found. That whatever happened to her, wherever she ended up, might remain hidden forever. The mountains of East Tennessee are vast, dense, full of places where a small body could be hidden and never discovered. Caves, abandoned wells, deep sections of forest that no one ever goes to. Water features where remains could have been disposed of. If someone wanted to hide a child's body in that terrain, they could probably do it successfully. The searches were extensive, but they couldn't cover everything. They couldn't search every square inch of wilderness. They focused on the most likely areas, the accessible areas, the places a child might wander, or where someone might quickly dispose of evidence. But there are 1,000 places they didn't search, couldn't search, places that would require specific information to even know to look there. This is the nightmare scenario for any missing person case. That the missing person will never be recovered. That the family will spend the rest of their lives not knowing, not having closure, not being able to properly grieve, living in a state of permanent limbo, where hope and despair exist simultaneously. Where every phone call might be the one that brings news. Where every stranger on the street might somehow be their missing loved one. It's a special kind of torture. And it's what Dawn Wells and Candace Bly have been living with for over 1,500 days. There's a theory in criminal investigation that whoever did this, if someone did something deliberate to Summer, they made a mistake. Criminals almost always make mistakes. Leave evidence, tell someone, act suspiciously, do something that, if investigators can find it, will expose them. The challenge is finding that mistake, identifying the error in the criminal's plan, the thing they didn't think of, the detail they overlooked, the person they trusted who they shouldn't have. In Summer's case, if there was a crime, whoever committed it either made no mistakes, which is extremely unlikely, or they made mistakes that investigators haven't identified yet. The Van Hill Road search might have been following up on one of those mistakes. A piece of evidence, a statement that didn't quite add up, a connection that someone finally noticed, or it might have been another dead end. We won't know until the TBI decides to tell us. One aspect of this case that's often overlooked is the psychological toll on the investigators themselves. The agents and detectives and deputies who have worked this case for 4 years, who have spent thousands of hours searching for a little girl they've never met, who have interviewed hundreds of people, who have followed thousands of leads, who have given up time with their own families to look for someone else's child. That takes a toll. Working child cases is emotionally draining under the best circumstances. When you can't solve the case, when years pass without answers, the frustration and guilt can be overwhelming. Even though intellectually they know they've done everything possible, even though logically they understand that some cases just don't break, emotionally it's hard not to feel like they've failed. Failed Summer, failed her family, failed the community that's counting on them to provide answers. Josh Melton, in interviews, has been refreshingly honest about this, about how difficult this case has been, how frustrating, how it weighs on him and his team. But he's also been clear that they won't quit, won't give up, won't let this become another forgotten cold case. His commitment is admirable. His determination is what families in these situations need. But commitment and determination can only do so much when the evidence isn't there, when witnesses don't come forward, when the break they need doesn't materialize. At some point, even the most dedicated investigator hits a wall. They've done everything they can do. They're waiting for something new, something they don't have and can't create through effort alone. That's where the Summer Wells investigation seems to be. Waiting, hoping, ready to jump on any new lead, but essentially stalled until something breaks. The question that everyone asks is, will this case ever be solved? Will we ever know what happened to Summer Wells? The honest answer is, maybe. Some cold cases get solved decades later. Advances in technology, DNA databases, someone's conscience finally catching up with them, deathbed confessions, strange coincidences that lead to breakthroughs. It happens. The Golden State Killer was caught 40 years after his crimes through genetic genealogy. Other cases have been solved when someone finally came forward with information they'd kept secret for years. So it's possible. Summer's case could be solved tomorrow, or next year, or 10 years from now, or never. There's no way to know. What is certain is that the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation will keep this case active. They've made that commitment. They've shown through their actions, like the Van Hill Road search, that they're not just saying words. They're actually following up on leads, actually investigating, actually treating this as a priority. That's more than many families get. Many missing person cases, especially after this much time, get moved to cold case units where they're worked on sporadically, if at all. Summer's case is still in the active investigation stage, still assigned to full-time investigators, still receiving resources. That gives her family and the community reason to hope. But hope is exhausting when it goes on for years without fulfillment. When you hope every day that today will be the day you get answers, and every day you don't, it wears on you. It's hard to maintain that level of emotional intensity for weeks, let alone months or years. At some point, most people have to find a way to live with the uncertainty, to accept that they may never know, to create some kind of life, even with this massive unanswered question hanging over everything. That's what Dawn and Candace are trying to do, trying to live, trying to survive, trying to find moments of something other than grief and fear and confusion. It's not really living, not in the full sense, but it's survival, and sometimes survival is all you can manage. As we approach the end of this story, or at least the end of what we know so far, it's important to remember who Summer Wells was. Not just a case, not just a mystery, a real child, a little girl who loved being outside, who loved her brothers, who loved helping plant flowers, who had her whole life ahead of her, who should be 8 years old right now, who should be learning and growing and experiencing all the things that 8-year-olds experience. Instead, she's a photograph, a name, a story that true crime enthusiasts dissect and analyze. That's not anyone's fault, necessarily. It's just the reality of what happens when tragedies become public cases. The person at the center becomes almost abstract, a symbol, a puzzle to be solved. We forget sometimes that this was a real child with real feelings and real experiences. A child who loved and was loved, who mattered to people, who left a hole in her family's life that can never be filled. And maybe that's the most important thing to remember about this case. Beyond all the speculation and theories and analysis, beyond the questions about what happened and who might be responsible and why investigators can't solve it, at the center of all of this is a little girl who deserves to be remembered as a person, as Summer. Not as the Summer Wells case, not as an unsolved mystery, but as Summer, a child who lived and laughed and played, and who, for reasons we don't understand, is no longer with her family. If you've watched this far, if you've stayed with this story through all its twists and unanswered questions and frustrating dead ends, thank you. Thank you for caring about Summer. Thank you for keeping her story alive. Because that matters. In a world where stories come and go, where today's tragedy is forgotten by tomorrow, where attention spans are measured in seconds, the fact that people still care about what happened to Summer Wells 4 years later, that matters. It keeps pressure on the investigation. It keeps the case in the public eye. It increases the chances, however slightly, that someone who knows something will finally come forward. If you have any information about Summer Wells, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please contact the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Their hotline is 1-800-TBI-FIND. That's 1-800-824-3463. You can also call the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office. You can remain anonymous if you want. You can call in a tip without giving your name. But if you know something, if you saw something, if you heard something, please call. Please share that information. Because somewhere, a family is desperate for answers, desperate to know what happened to their little girl, desperate for closure, desperate for justice, and you might have the piece of information that finally provides that. Summer Wells was 3 feet tall, approximately 40 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a pink shirt and gray shorts. She may have been barefoot. She disappeared from her home on Ben Hill Road in Hawkins County, Tennessee, on June 15, 2021, at approximately 6:30 in the evening. She would now be 8 years old. If you have seen her, if you have any information about what happened to her, please call law enforcement immediately. For everyone who has followed this case, for everyone who has invested emotional energy into hoping for Summer's safe return, for everyone who has shared her photo and her story, I want to leave you with this. Cases like this are hard. They're frustrating. They challenge our sense of how the world should work. We want to believe that children are safe in their homes, that when something bad happens, investigators can figure it out and fix it, that justice prevails, that good wins. But reality is more complicated. Sometimes bad things happen and we never understand why. Sometimes children disappear and we never find them. Sometimes families never get the answers they deserve. That's painful to accept. It goes against everything we want to believe about the world. But acknowledging that reality doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean stop caring. It doesn't mean Summer's case doesn't matter. It means understanding that solving these cases is hard, that investigators are doing their best with what they have, that sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, cases remain unsolved, and that our job, as people who care, is to keep paying attention, keep sharing, keep hoping, keep putting pressure on the system to find answers. Because the alternative, forgetting, letting these cases fade away, that's not acceptable. Every missing child deserves to have people fighting for them, searching for them, refusing to give up on them. Summer Wells is one of those children. She's been missing for over 4 years, more than 1,500 days, and we still don't know what happened to her. We don't know if she wandered off and got lost. We don't know if she was abducted. We don't know if she's alive or dead. We don't know where she is. We don't know who might be responsible. We don't know anything for certain, except that on June 15, 2021, a little girl disappeared, and despite one of the most intensive search operations in Tennessee history, she has never been found. The Van Hill Road search in November 2024 was a reminder that people are still looking, still investigating, still following leads, still hoping for a breakthrough. Whether that search will lead to anything significant remains to be seen. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation isn't telling us, and they won't until they're ready, until they have something solid, until they've built a case that can survive legal scrutiny. So we wait, we hope, we share Summer's story, and we trust that somewhere, someone knows something, and that eventually, for whatever reason, they'll do the right thing and come forward. Until then, Summer Wells remains missing. Her family remains without answers. Her community remains haunted by what happened. And her case remains one of the most baffling, frustrating, and heartbreaking missing child investigations in modern American history. If this case matters to you, if you want to see justice for Summer Wells, I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to the Cold Case Desk. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this video. Share it on every platform you have. Post it to Facebook, tweet it, put it on Reddit. Send it to people who care about these cases, because every single view, every single share, every single comment keeps Summer's story alive, keeps her face in front of people, keeps pressure on this investigation, keeps her name in the public consciousness where it belongs. Drop a comment telling me what you think about this case, what theories you have, what questions you want answered. But most importantly, drop a comment with Summer's name. Say her name, remember her. Because that's what matters most. That 4 years later, people still remember Summer Wells, still care about what happened to her, still demand answers. Subscribe to the Cold Case Desk, because we don't let cases go quiet. We don't let children be forgotten. We keep asking questions, keep demanding justice, keep fighting for answers even when it seems hopeless, even when years pass without breakthroughs, even when it would be easier to move on to newer, more sensational cases. We stay. We remember. We keep pushing. Summer Wells deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. And somewhere out there, someone knows what happened. Maybe that someone will see this video. Maybe they'll finally find the courage to come forward. Maybe this will be the push they need to do the right thing. That's the hope. That's why we keep making these videos. That's why we keep telling these stories. Because maybe, just maybe, we'll reach the right person at the right time and finally, get the answers everyone has been searching for. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for keeping Summer's memory alive. I'll see you in the next case, but I hope the next time we talk about Summer Wells, it's because there's been a breakthrough, because investigators finally got the lead they needed, because someone came forward with information, because this family finally has answers. That's what we all hope for. That's what we all pray for. That's what Summer deserves. Remember Summer Wells. Share her story. And never stop asking questions. This is the Cold Case Desk, where every case deserves to be solved.